The scene, Washington, D.C., 2009. Our hero, Andrew Heaton, has returned from his master's degree. Unable to find anything approaching suit and tie work on a standard career track, he has stumbled into a gig as a Segway tour guide. He looks very cool as a Segway tour guide. You might think he looks like a total dork riding a Segway wearing his bicycle helmet, but you are wrong. He looks like Caesar standing atop a chariot addressing his troops while wearing a bicycle helmet. One day, as Heaton is delivering his charges back to the store, at the end of an excellent and very entertaining tour ranging from the White House to the National Mall to Congress, Heaton is pulled over by police officers, and he grows worried. Did he violate some traffic law? Did one of the people on his tour do something? The police officer approaches Heaton, who again looks reminiscent of Julius Caesar standing atop of a chariot, and asks to see his tour guide license. Heaton is baffled. What tour guide license? He asks. Why would I need a license to be a tour guide? The cop is very polite and explains, in Washington, D.C., you are required to have a license to give professional tours. I'm going to let you wrap this tour up. You can finish today's tour. But if I see you giving a tour again illegally without a license, we will have to take you into the precinct and fine you. And then Heaton asks some follow-up questions, and he says, yes, if you do it multiple times, we'll arrest you. Heaton, who is much younger at this time, doesn't yet have to wake up in the middle of the night to pee. Heaton is more naive and innocent than he is now. He assumes that the city of Washington has instituted a licensing regime for tour guides as a matter of public safety. That makes sense. He is, after all, spiriting adults and high school students on borrowed, novel vehicles which look cool through busy intersections and roads and sidewalks. So he understands that civic leaders might want to ensure people in his position know basic traffic laws, as well as some emergency coordination, such as who to call in the event of an accident or what to do if somebody, God forbid, is hit by a car. The first sign that Heaton has woefully misinterpreted the situation comes when he shows up to take the tour guide license test. His occupation, tour guide, is in the same category on the forms as plumbers and professional wrestlers, which do not at all strike Heaton as comparable professions. But he fills out the form, pays the application and testing fees to the district, and proceeds to a small classroom to fill out a multiple choice exam necessary to pass to obtain his license. The exam is stupid, beyond stupid. There are at least 3 questions about the Octagon House. Have you ever heard of the Octagon House? No, you have not, because you're a normal person who, when visiting Washington, will want to see the White House or Congress or the Spy Museum. The Octagon House briefly served as the official residence of President Madison when the British burned down the White House and is probably very pretty and maybe even potentially interesting, but it is by no means the sort of thing a tourist will ever inquire about. Even a high school geometry teacher who's obsessed with octagons and is married to a history teacher who's obsessed with houses, that guy is unlikely to ever ask a tour guide, what is the actual name of the Octagon House? Which is, you will not be at all interested to know, the Colonel John Taylor III House. Again, there are 3 questions about the Octagon House. Most of the other questions are pretty standard. What is the Treasury? What are the 2 houses of Congress? Who the flying hell is Colonel John Taylor III, and why should I or anybody on a Segway tour remotely care? But some of the questions literally don't make any sense. One reads, how much land in the District of Columbia is owned by the federal government? A, 10, B, 25, C, 36, or D, 75? Heaton approaches the proctor at the front of the room and says, sir, I do not understand this question. What don't you understand about the question? Asked the proctor. Well, The question does not specify what the numbers refer to. Is the question asking about the percentage of land owned by the federal government? Is it acreage or hectares? Without clarifying what the numbers are, the question itself is nonsensical. And at that time, the proctor gives a look to young Heaton, which telepathically communicates the following to him. Son, this is a bullshit exam. It's bullshit. The exam here is for two purposes. You had to pay an application fee, which goes to the city, and the city appreciates that application fee. That's revenue that we get from people that want to work. And the exam is a speed bump. It doesn't matter what any of the questions are, particularly about the Octagon House. The purpose has absolutely nothing to do with public safety or even quality control of tours. It's just a speed bump, which the Tour Guide Licensing Board has enacted to make it just a little bit more expensive and time-consuming and inconvenient enough that everybody who already has a license doesn't have to compete with a bunch of transient upstart tour guides. That's it. It's just a legal speed bump. Heaton is aghast. He realizes all at once that the government, in an unholy alliance with a bunch of feckless establishment tour guides who walk around on foot like peasants, utterly segue-less, this unholy alliance has conspired against him to take his money and inconvenience him and potentially fine or even imprison his colleagues if they don't jump through all of the ridiculous same hurdles to protect the insiders already in the industry. Heaton grows dejected. What can he do? What can he do but carry on with this charade? And that is when he sees a Force ghost, the blue, glowing soul of a man in Jedi robes. Heaton, says the Force ghost, use your lightsaber. Strike down the Sith. It's Barry Goldwater. The Force ghost of Barry Goldwater is urging Heaton to destroy the Tour Guide Licensing Board in an epic lightsaber battle. And so he does. Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I have been irritated by many ridiculous occupational licensing boards at this point in my life, well into the period of my life where I have to wake up to use the bathroom at night. In fact, we've done an episode or two on occupational licensing previously, where I'm mostly focused on what you just heard, the protectionist, anti-competitive, cronyist racket element of occupational licensing. Then, recently, a listener suggested I check out a book called The Licensing Racket by Rebecca Allensworth, who we will hear from shortly, and I fell in love with hating occupational licensing all over again. In large part because I had at least thought real licensing boards, because the Tour Guide Licensing Board is utter bullshit, but I thought maybe real licensing boards that have a nominal point, like the American Bar Association or medical licensing boards, stuff that most people would say, okay, there should be some requirements attached to this profession. I thought they were at least doing quality control. Yeah, they're anti-competitive. They're apt to restrict supply in order to drive up salaries for their members at the expense of us consumers, but they are keeping us safe from quacks and crooks. If only. My guest today, who is by trade an antitrust professor, spent years attending licensing board meetings, which, I'm just going to repeat that, spent years voluntarily during peacetime attending licensing board meetings, observing their disciplinary procedures, tabulating data on just how useful they actually are to public welfare and safety, and her findings are damning. Yes, I said it. Damning. Let me give you an example real quick, which is just from this last week. It's not even in the book because it's too recent to appear in the book. Did you know that most states have licensing boards for funeral directors and embalmers, which always struck me as odd because the worst case for a funeral director, like if you really screwed up, the worst case for a funeral director is you bring the corpse back to life. But let's assume that there's some good rationale for this. There's, I don't know, biohazardous embalming chemicals that are very, very dangerous. They need to be regulated by the licensing board. Not very likely anybody's going to die, what with everybody already being dead, but also there's quality control issues. What if an unscrupulous, presumably very pale funeral director, like, I don't know, did a side hustle selling bones to voodoo doctors, or didn't properly refrigerate corpses, or didn't keep track of which urn had whose ashes? The licensing board exists explicitly to stop unscrupulous, presumably gaunt weirdos from doing that kind of thing. You and me and the other people mourning at the funeral, we're not going to wander into the back, start lifting open coffins to check the quality control at the morgue. So the licensing board does that for us to protect us. Last week in Pennsylvania, the Attorney General announced that one Jacob Vereb, owner of Vereb Funeral Home and Eternity Pet Memorial in Pittsburgh, was charged with improper disposal of animal bodies. More specifically, in a 3-year period, he had taken over $650,000 from grieving pet owners who had paid him to cremate their dogs and cats. In reality, Vereb had dumped thousands of those dogs and cats into landfills and gave the people who missed those animals very expensive, entirely random ashes. Now, granted, this is an anecdotal example of a licensing board failing to protect the public from a criminal. It is a single data point, but I will argue that it is both anecdotal and emblematic, because licensing boards exist primarily to protect their members from competition, and only in second place to patrol their members for the good of the public. Today, we're going to talk about the racket and failure of licensing boards and what to do about them, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Rebecca Allensworth. She is the Associate Dean of Research at Vanderbilt Law, where she focuses on antitrust and licensing. She is the author of The Licensing Racket: How We Decide Who is Allowed to Work and Why It Goes Wrong. Hello, Rebecca. A pleasure to have you.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So I mentioned this right before we started talking, but I have been dabbling in licensing reform for a few years now, and I loved your book. I think that your book is really insightful and takes very novel approaches to licensing beyond the kind of standard, it's just a protection racket.
Yeah, thank you. That was the goal. I was very familiar with that take, and it's not that I think that take is wrong. I mean, obviously the book is called The Licensing Racket. But I thought there was a lot more to it. And I thought there were a lot of stories that could be told out there about how exactly it goes wrong. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, let's set the parameters for this first. How big is licensing in the United States? What's the impact of it? How many people are affected by it?
It's huge. It's the most important labor regulatory intervention we have, because it covers about 20% of the workforce, the way I define professional licensing. 20%, which is tens of millions of workers, probably about 30 million workers in the U.S. It's bigger than unions. It's bigger, certainly, than the minimum wage. So I argue that it is the most important way in which we regulate workers.
Yeah, I think some of the data that you have referenced in the book is it's about 10 times larger than the minimum wage.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And you said that as you define it. So are you defining it in a particular way, or you're making a distinction between licensing and certifications, just to make sure we've got our terms down?
Yeah, exactly. So there's two ways in which I further define it a little bit more narrowly. Okay, so the one is we're not talking about certification, which would be you go and you get some sort of voluntary certificate saying I'm particularly good at this. I've taken this educational program. And but so the difference there is that you are still allowed legally to do the work even if you haven't done the certificate.
Okay, right.
But the other difference between professional licensing and what is often called occupational licensing is that I'm only including those things that require a big investment in human capital. So a significant investment in education or a test, not like a weekend CPR course. And in this sense, my definition differs a little bit from some economists use. And so you'll see figures out there saying 30% of the American workforce is licensed. And that's why we get to these different numbers slightly.
Okay, so the meaningful distinction for you is you're looking at how onerous it is. If there's a thing where for me to get licensed, I have to send $80 to the DMV or whatever, and then they send the thing back and I'm out $80, but that's it. You're not really worried about that. You're worried about the time commitments and the financial commitments.
Exactly. I'm interested in the system of creating real barriers to entry for people. Exactly.
So the more I read your book, I went from beginning it with the position of this is mostly a racket to this is literally a medieval guild system. I don't think the medieval guild system went away. I think we live in a medieval guild system. Am I right?
I think that's right. And one thing that's worth noting is how many new professions are trying to get in on the guild system. Like how many, like it's been for a long time that we've called medicine to be, similar to a guild, but a lot of new professions are now trying to get into that kind of system of regulation.
Okay, so walk us through, what does this guild system look like? For people that, a lot of people that listen to this show have heard me ranting about licensing in the past, but for people that are new, that are unfamiliar with occupational licensing or professional licensing, we're a medieval guild system. How does this operate for the average person that's going into a profession?
Well, the medieval guilds were, a sort of self-defined profession where you could get in only with permission from members of that existing profession. And that's basically how the licensing system works now. And the way they work in a guild kind of way is through the boards. Licensing boards are ostensibly state agencies, but they're made up almost in every case by a majority of professionals. And they're going to decide who gets in. And, it's a protection racket is kind of like the unfair, simple way of talking about it. And that it was roughly what my hypothesis was going into the research. But there's this other side of the guild system, which is, once you're in, you're really in. And so even in the face of very extreme misconduct, boards, when they regulate themselves in this way, they tend to go very easy on their own. So it's a protection racket, not just protectionist, like the way we use that word in economics, but also like protecting the bad actors in the profession from the consequences of their behavior.
Right. I think if we were to travel back in time and hang out with the Masons Guild in 12th century England, I think they would go, look, the guild exists to protect our workers. That's the point of our guild. Our guild is not for the benefit of society. Our guild is not for the benefit of consumers. It's to look, we're here for the Masons. We're the Masons Guild. And I think the principal difference is that the licensing boards that you talk about at length in the book are functionally there for the benefit of the workers. They're a self-regulating board that regulates the profession, but are rhetorically there for the benefit of the consumer. But the data does not seem to back that up.
So that's right. So all these statutes that create these boards are they recite public health and safety as their reason for existing, and the point of all the regulations. So in that sense, they are supposed to be very different from the guilds. But then, in operation, they're a lot like the guilds. And I think this idea that there needs to be an entity there to protect the profession and serve the interests of the profession is kind of already covered by associations. So, we still have that function of we got to look out for our workers. We have to look out for this profession. That's the private. It's like a trade association, a professional association.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that through this dominance of the boards and the statutory composition that have to be made up of members of the profession, we've kind of put the associations in charge of licensing. Now, associations are very conflicted about public protection. Sometimes the interests align, but a lot of times they don't. One more thing I'll say about protecting workers, people have been making this argument actually recently, not a lot of people, but a couple, saying that these boards or licensing, maybe it's not as bad as it seems because maybe they do protect the workers. Yeah, statutes say it's for the public, and maybe there's some evidence for that, maybe not. But to the extent that unionization has declined, other worker protections have declined, maybe licensing is filling a role here that the guilds did to protect the members of that profession. And I just think this is very perverse as it actually plays out on the ground in terms of a way of protecting workers.
Can you elaborate on that? Because that seemed to me to be the only real pitch for licensing boards by the end of your book, where We'll get into some of the other things, but by the end, I was like, oh wow, these are wretched at quality control. They're really bad at quality control. So you gave me even more reasons. Like my blood pressure raised by 30% over the course of reading your book.
That was the
So
goal.
there were lots of things that really irritated me. Not about the book, but about the situation that you're describing in the book. The one thing that I could kind of see though is if you are a worker in one of these licensing regimes, like you are really protected from competition, from outsiders. You're protected from incrimination because like nobody wants to rat out people of their own profession. So that's not something you think is a compelling argument.
No, I don't. And it's not because you're wrong. I mean, it is good to be a licensed profession and it's good to be in the profession, with that protection. It's everybody else, I think, that we need to think about. So, all of that comes at the cost to consumers. There's a reason why the statutes recite consumer safety and protection. Um, and that is both in the, too much red tape part of the problem. So the more we have higher standards, the better it is for the professionals because it's harder to get into the profession. They can charge more, they have more autonomy, and they're more in control of their own kind of work life. So that can be bad for consumers because consumers have to pay more if they can get it at all. Lots of scarcity. This is a real problem in healthcare. And then as far as the consumer protection part goes for the discipline, for when there are bad actors in the profession, that protectionism really comes at the cost of patients and clients because you have all kinds of, I mean, I don't want to say all kinds of, I don't want to overstate the 1% of bad actors in these professions, but 1% of millions of people can actually be quite a bit. And those 1%.
If 1% of pilots were inclined to fly into trees, we wouldn't go, it's only 1%. You got to have 100% with pilots.
Only 1% of pilots, show up to work drunk. Well, it turns out there's actually a relatively robust system for identifying, drug use among pilots and drug and alcohol use among pilots. And it's not treated as, oh, this pilot has this personal problem that, he's really struggled with, and we're going to try to support him in his rehabilitation by allowing him to fly planes. That's not whereas when it comes to physicians and it comes to lawyers, this is the attitude that boards take. So the consumers lose from even if we were to look at this as a way to protect consumers, to protect workers, the consumers lose out. And as far as protecting workers, it does that only by excluding all kinds of workers who can't get the license. So a lot of attention has been paid to the idea of people with criminal records being shut out by licensing. A lot of licensing regimes say you can't have a felony or you can't have this kind of felony. But even more fundamentally, it's just very expensive to become a licensed professional. You have to take at least a year off of work. You're out of the labor market in that sense. You're, crashing with a family member if you have that kind of privilege, right? You have to be able to be book smart enough to pass these tests, even for hair. So there's it's a tremendous investment that not everybody can make. And so when we keep workers out through licensing, we're often keeping the workers out that traditionally experience discrimination and other struggles on the labor market.
Well, I want to come back to the costs of it because that's where I begin with. But the quality control is really what fascinated me about the book because that was new to me, that the quality control was so abysmal. I will make my best case argument, or rather what I think a licensing board would say, and I'd like you to countermand this with any analysis or facts that you've got at your disposal. I think most licensing boards would say the average consumer does not have the information necessary to make an informed choice in our field. I represent the proctologist licensing board for the great state of Virginia, and you don't know who's a good proctologist or not. For that reason, there's asymmetric information, and we need to have some kind of quality control to make sure that you aren't getting a quack. And who better to regulate this group of proctologists than proctologists? We know the field. And so we are going to police our own, and we have a very strong incentive to do so because the prestige and quality of our profession is inherently important to us.
Yeah, no, this is the argument. And it is an argument that has proved incredibly effective with legislatures. And also, I'll just make a quick note. Part of why it's so effective with legislatures is how cheap it is. It's like, oh, we'll regulate ourselves. Oh, really? How much will you charge us for
So
that? Oh,
I
it's
can go
free.
back to like doing culture war stuff and I don't have to spend any money on this. Terrific. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Barbers, you license yourselves. Great.
Yeah. Get out of my office. I've got, like you said, I've got like guns and abortion on the docket.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
not important to me. So the self-regulation is easy for legislatures to kind of pass off, and it has this logic to it that you just identified, which is who better to do this than members of the profession. And what I would say about that is everything you said up until the point of who better to do this, I agree with. And in fact, in that sense, I depart from a lot of libertarian perspectives. This is not a libertarian book. This is not a book about cut all the red tape, get rid of licensing. I do argue that for some professions, but not for something like medicine or law. And that's because people don't know what they're getting. And you don't know if you're getting good representation. You don't know if you're getting good medical care. And so we need to have some sort of minimum competency to make sure that, what you're getting is appropriate care and services. But who better to do it? I mean, the answer there is somebody who is less conflicted than the members of the profession, and specifically members of the profession that have been sort of enculturated by their association, which most is true for most board members. Somebody who's less conflicted and more clear-eyed about the real consequences of regulation. So sometimes that's going to involve needing some expert information from members of the profession. Sometimes you're going to have to take data or testimony. You're going to have to gather information about what is the right diagnostic technique here. How often do you see this kind of patient? Was this really out of line? But so much more goes into making the decision besides just the clinical question. Like, for example, what are the public health effects of overprescribing? These are not really questions that an individual, gynecologist or something has the answer to serving on the board. So the appeal to expertise, I think, that you just made is real. It works. It's overblown. And it underestimates the other important set of expertise that is sacrificed when we use kind of just day-to-day practitioners who may know their own field, their own narrow practice context, but they don't see the big picture of their regulation.
Yeah. And I there's a lot of conflict of interest that's going on that we would not tolerate in other situations. It's not exactly the same because we don't quite have this phenomenon with police. But for example, police unions will advocate for all sorts of things where if you kill a guy and you're convicted of murder, you still get your pension. You absolutely get your pension because it's the job of the police union to advocate for police. It's not the job of the police union to advocate for everybody. They're just gunning for poor choice of words. They're just advocating for police. That's a big part of what's going on with the licensing boards is they have that obligation. Some of the most damning data that you have in the book, and forgive me, I'm gonna not get the numbers correct, but when we're just looking empirically at what the boards do, you bring up that it's 90% of the activity is prosecuting anybody that's operating without a license, and maybe 10% is actually going through problems with people in the profession. So the rhetoric is we're here for the consumer to make sure they don't get shoddy proctologists, the worst thing in the world. They're going to get a good prostate exam. But the reality is that we exist mostly to make sure that our jobs are secure from outside competition, and we're only dedicating a tiny minority of our time and energy to actually governing our own.
Yeah. Well, so that data is not from medicine, but I think it does reveal. So, one challenge of writing a book like this is I'm trying to write about all the professions, and obviously they're all very different. In fact, one of the things that's crazy is that we use the same regulatory structure to govern, hair professionals and physicians. So, what you can say about some professions, you can't say about others. So that figure you quoted is correct. I think it was either the alarm system installers or maybe the auctioneers.
I probably shouldn't use the proctologist. That's just a funnier profession. I'm sorry. It would be better if we're using the standard hair braider or plumbers or something like that, something non-lethal.
I tried very hard to get out of the hair trope in writing this book, but I didn't manage to do it. I have a whole chapter on hair.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some professions like auctioneers, alarm system installers, court reporters that are fighting for the idea of licensure. Maybe they're not licensed in every state. They haven't won that battle everywhere. And they're also for that reason or related to that, there's not really a lot of public protection arguments that you can make very well. So, for auctioneers, you're going to say that people abscond with your funds. They misrepresent the items in the auction. For alarm system installers, you're going to say they come to old people's homes who already have an alarm system, scare them into buying a second, kind of like this predatory sales technique. Okay, so those are the justifications. And in those professions, 90%, something like that, of the discipline is against unlicensed practitioners. And that's because those professions are trying to hold on to licensure. They have to go after everybody who's unlicensed because otherwise, what are we doing here, right? We don't really have a licensed profession if actually you can kind of, do some auctioneering on the side. And what's interesting about that to me is that there actually were a couple of complaints that were like, my father's old, he has Alzheimer's, somebody came to his home and scared him into buying a really expensive system. He already had a system. Or, somebody told me this was an original painting and it was a print. And they dismissed those. So they used those arguments as this is what we need to protect. But when it came to actually doing the discipline, they're only going after the stuff that's protectionist.
Yeah.
So protectionism looks a little different, I think, in terms of the numbers and discipline. For medicine, it's sort of there too. But that was really, I think, what really showed me that these professions maybe ought not to be licensed at all if you can't actually go after the kinds of risks that you identify when you're telling a legislature or whatever that we need licensing in this field.
My rule of thumb for a long time has been if you screw up and a body fluid you don't want to shoots out of you, there's some sort of electric or blood related danger. If you mess up, then I think it should be licensed. Outside of that, I think it should all be certifications. But I'm glad you make that distinction between the kind of economic protectionism, which is rife in those sort of non-dangerous ones. But when we look at the quality control, that was the thing that was really eye-opening to me, is that so within medical boards, I think most people, myself would included, would say, you should have a license to be a doctor. You don't need a license to be an auctioneer. That's stupid. But okay, doctor, I want there to be some kind of floor there. That being said, though, I did not get the impression that the licensing boards are actually good at quality control. You bring up two doctors in the book. You bring up Dr. Edward Owens, and I believe the other was Paglia. Can you walk us through what they did and how the licensing boards treated them?
Yeah. So you talked about a floor. I also thought there was a floor. And I thought my book was going to be mostly about the protectionist kind of stuff, the red tape. And I went to the medical board first because I thought that in the whole red tape, libertarian debate, the medicine got a free pass because, like you just said, you'd have to be a real nut job to think that there should be no licensing for medicine. There are some nut jobs like that out there, but, and you can always waive the safety argument very effectively in that kind of profession. But I thought maybe the doctors were having too much red tape anyway, right? You can go too far. Even if you should be licensed, you can go too far. And I think that's true, basically. But I wanted to see it myself, so I started out by going to a licensing board meeting and to a medical board meeting first. And the very first meeting I went to, this doctor, Dr. Owens, his name has been changed.
Because I Googled him and he didn't pop up. So that would be why I was like, wow, he did a really good job of evading Google. Okay, name changed.
So, side note, there was a lot of choices that some names were changed. Dr. LaPaglia's was not.
He did show up in the Google results. And he looks like the guy you describe in the book. He popped up and I was like, that's the guy.
My thought was if you had enough of the information out there already in the public, I wasn't going to change your name. And if you held yourself out as a government official, right, or you held yourself out as an advocate, or you were kind of holding yourself out. So this doctor didn't really pass those tests. And so I changed his name. But anyway, so I saw him get his license back, and I thought he was a new applicant. That was strange to me. I was in the agenda, new applicant. It's like, okay, what's this going to be? And it turned out he had lost his license the year before for having sex with 11 of his patients. He was an OBGYN in inner city Memphis. He saw mostly African-American women. And he admitted to struggling with drug use problems, with sex addiction, and with gambling addiction. He admitted to having sex with 11 of his patients and compensating them with off-book prescriptions with street
Uh-huh.
value. He
Okay.
knew and he believed they were reselling them on the street. So he lost his license, and then he was there to get it back. And I found this all very confusing because it had been less than a year since he had his license revoked. He seemed manifestly to have violated almost everything that you might care about from a doctor. This is 2018, so Me Too was at its
Sexual
height.
misconduct, gross negligence, and aiding and abetting pill selling? Yeah.
Yeah, it really ticked a lot of boxes. And the whole vibe of the hearing was, you've been through so much mental health treatment. How can we support you in your recovery? We
Mm-hmm.
can't give you a completely clean license. You're going to have to be on probation. You're going to have somebody in the room with you, a chaperone, when you do exams. But how can we do that to raise the least amount of notice among your patients? We don't want to single you out. We don't want them to think that, anything untoward is happening. And yeah, that was basically what most of the debate was about. And that thing you're doing right now, your
Yeah,
head is
for
going to
listeners, I've got
explode.
my hands on my head in a very "the hell is happening here"
Yeah,
pose.
that is exactly what I was doing mentally, sitting in my seat. I was like, what is going on? What is going on?
So, okay, I just want to make sure I got the facts here. This fella had sex and admitted to having
Yeah.
sex with 11 of his patients,
Yeah.
which I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to ever have sex with your patient when you're in a,
Sometimes at work.
yeah,
Okay.
sometimes
So
at work. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that you're supposed to have a professional barrier like between your patients. And he compensated these women with pills that he also agreed he thought they were probably selling on the street.
yes.
So, and there, I mean, like somehow, if I'd been appointed to the Tennessee Medical Board as advocate dude, I would have been like, this guy, this is exactly why we're here, gang. We're here to protect the public. This is rhetorically why we're here. This man should never practice medicine again, and we should revoke his license, and we should send an official notice of censure to every other medical board in the country to ensure that they don't allow him to practice again. Best
Yeah.
of luck in whatever your next profession is, but you've blown it 100%. You don't get to do this again. Like you crashed your plane into a tree drunk. You don't get to fly planes anymore for United Airlines. Good luck to you. And their reaction was, look, he's one of our guys. And he, can you imagine when he left medical school all bright-eyed, wanting to help the world, and something happened, and if we can just get him back on that track, wouldn't that be better for him? It was all on the doctors. It wasn't on the public.
I think that that's right. I will adjust one thing you said. As you said, he's one of our guys. I think it's too much to say that the board members identified with him. And I think that's actually, in some ways, part of the problem, because they viewed these patients as his prostitutes. One of them said that to me. And it was kind of like, look, you don't really understand. These are not your friends and neighbors. These are not patients off the street. These are his prostitutes. And that's not really what the board is here for. We're kind of here for a different kind of patient, I guess, a different kind of person who might, need our protection. And so it really was sort of this, it wasn't quite he's one of ours. It was almost like he's not one of ours. Like he's not seeing the kinds of patients that we care about. He's not seeing he's not practicing in the kind of context that we think is important. And so we're just going to sort of, by the way, this is an underserved community, which means that it'd be really devastating to that community to remove a practitioner. So they say that around the same time that they say, this is a community that we're going to not give the same kind of safety and protection to.
And to be clear, they told him in the meeting, we want to make sure that this draws the least amount of attention to your practice. Like we don't want to punish you by like telling people that you had sex with 11 of your patients that have been censured by the board. We're going to keep that private.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't put it so clearly as that, but yes, it was very clear that they did not want the patients to be alerted to his past troubles. Absolutely. They kept talking about fresh start. That was very important to them. And it was part of why they gave him a new license. They were talking about, look, this will be a new license number. Like this is your fresh start. So yeah, I think that what's interesting to me too is that it was actually one of the closer votes I saw. So there were some doctors that objected. I think that 3 voted no. I actually think 2 of them might have voted no because they thought that the terms were too harsh. But I know one of them at least voted no because of what you just said. Go find another profession. You've blown it. This is it. And that's clearly what I think the public would have thought, what you and I would have thought sitting in this hearing. The public members of the board, people who are not doctors, I think thought that too. In fact, one of them said to me afterwards, I would never let my daughter go see him.
Sure.
And she had just voted to give him his license back.
Really?
And, and then another doctor said, don't worry, he only sees 10 care patients. As in, your daughter's not going to go see him. You don't have to worry about it.
This is a poor person doctor.
Yeah, 10 care is our Medicaid program.
Okay.
So, and the logic goes like this. The logic is, he can be rehabilitated. He has these mental health struggles. He's really worked to address them. And once those go away, he suddenly becomes this totally competent, normal doctor again because he's dealt with his issues. And that represents $1.5 million of investment, the public's investment in this doctor. And we're not just going to throw it in a ditch. You wouldn't take a machine that had a broken belt and just throw it in a ditch. You would fix the belt and put it back out there. I mean, lots of problems with this, right? You're putting it back out there into, an African-American community in Memphis. That's one problem. Another problem is I don't know that drug addiction, sex addiction, gambling addiction issues are like broken belts that you can just fix them.
Let's say if my Buick were molesting children, I would have a very different interpretation of the costs that were involved in it.
There's also a lot of doctors out there who struggle and lawyers who struggle with substance use disorder and don't take it out on their patients. I mean, this is really important to emphasize. I'm not advocating for a world in which if you struggle with substance use, then you shouldn't have a license. That's a very different circumstance than this, where there was really manifest, long-term, admitted patient harm.
I think I know the answer to this question. But when a doctor is convicted by a medical board for sexual misconduct or gross negligence, does the public even know? Like if their license isn't suspended, the board goes, you have to have somebody come in once a week to look at your books and have a conversation about whether you're having sex with your patients and a conversation about overprescribing pills. And you're on probation, mister. Does this become public information? Because I as a consumer, would like to know this if I were going to a doctor, that the doctor had been cited for gross negligence and malpractice by the medical board.
So it often does. So if the board has a full hearing, and then they have public discipline, which is, anything where they're actually going to put restrictions on your license, like you have to have a chaperone or whatever, that's going to technically be public. But the states each have different systems for presenting that information to the public. It certainly doesn't go on the front of your practice. And it's probably not going to make it into your, doc info, like it might, but, on your sort of online profile. Usually you have to search the state database individually, and they can be harder or easier to search. So the first thing you'd have to think of is, I'm going to go see a proctologist. You seem to want to talk about proctologists. I want to go to the proctologist today. The first thing you're going to think is, I'm going to look them up in the state website, state database. That's probably not something you're thinking because A, you're thinking if he's a working proctologist, he's probably not, this criminal or have this kind of history. And B, you don't know about this database. You don't know to go to it. So you can. The other problem is it's state by state. There is a national data bank that kind of pulls all this information together along with hospital reporting of problems and also malpractice. That is private. That cannot be searched by patients to get the doctor information. That's for another purpose. It's not for patients. So I think the answer to your question is no. The public doesn't know about it, but not because it's legally actually hidden, but because there's not a good way to learn.
Okay.
There's not a lot of public awareness about it. And you cannot learn about an accusation. You cannot learn about a case that was investigated and closed. We're just looking at a very small percentage of these kinds of cases that make it to the public realm.
And before we move forward, can you just elaborate or describe Dr. Paglia and what Paglia
Yeah,
got up to?
Dr. LaPaglia. So his situation is in some ways better and worse than Dr. Owen's, right? It's better in the sense that the actual patient harm, at least in the stuff that he was convicted of, may be a little bit milder. What's worse about it is how many chances the board gave him. So he was an ER doctor in East Tennessee, and the police were called out to his home for a domestic, and they found a whole bunch of drugs he wasn't supposed to have, a whole bunch of marijuana, and a whole bunch of stuff from the hospital that he'd taken home. The board found out about this. He was charged criminally as well. The board found out about it and put his license on probation, took his ability to prescribe controlled substances. No problem, says Dr. LaPaglia. He finds a buddy at Dr. AA who has a valid...
Wait, is there a Dr. AA? Is it AA just for doctors?
It is, yeah, exactly.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So they meet there, and they figure, okay, well, Dr. LaPaglia is going to be in East Tennessee, sort of selling prescriptions for benzodiazepines and Suboxone. Suboxone is a low-dose opioid that's used to treat opioid use disorder, but it has a street value, understandably. So he's selling these scripts for cash, but of course they don't have his name on them because he's lost his ability to prescribe. He's has a bunch of pre-signed scripts from his partner, and he forges the signature when those run out. Does that for a while till he gets the attention of the feds. The feds charge him with 2 federal felonies, healthcare fraud and trafficking in narcotics. And then the licensing board does something very unusual, actually. They suspend his license temporarily, pending their ability to fully hear the case. And when they fully heard the case, this is a doctor who has, had a serious round of discipline. While on discipline with the board, did this workaround that amounted to federal fraud and drug trafficking, at least in the eyes of the feds. Well, he pled, so that's what happened. He pled to the federal case. What's the board going to do? I think anyone would expect that, you had your chance and you blew it. Dr. LaPaglia got his license back on arguably lighter terms than when he was on it in the first place. So now he's back on probation, working as a doctor and having to find other ways to make money, which he does. I don't know if you want me to get into those details, but
if he's abusing his doctor's license, sure.
Yeah, so he found a way to kind of go door to door selling fraudulent COVID tests for $50
Terrific.
a pop. It was like a second opinion. If you had a PCR test.
Oh, great. So if I was positive for COVID, but I wanted to go to the family reunion and I just couldn't do it without Aunt Cheryl getting on my back, I could call this guy and he'd go, no, actually this test says you're negative. Great.
You got something, but it's not COVID. Yeah, and this is high COVID. Okay, this is like really sort of the danger pre-vaccine era. So, he did get his license revoked after that. I would argue that part of why he got his license revoked after that was because of how much his story had blown up in the media. And there was a lot of attention on the board about what they were going to do. At that point, I had gone on This American Life, and it was sort of turned into a national story. But there's a path back. That he has. The description in revoking his license describes the things he has to do to get his license back. And one of the board members said, "I like this, that there's a description of a path back."
Really?
Yeah.
That is just mind-blowing to me. There's a quote you have in the book that I thought was eye-popping. Bad doctors and lawyers who are allowed to stay in their professions after disciplinary proceedings tend to lose their ability to work for high-end firms or hospitals or to take private insurance. They have few professional opportunities other than as doctors and lawyers to the uninsured, addicted, and poor, the incarcerated or accused. The licensing system keeps the worst of the worst in practice and then shunts them towards the most desperate members of the public.
This was one of the most interesting findings of my book, and it's something that I think nobody has really been talking about. Dr. LaPaglia is an example. So He was working in the mainstream when he first got in trouble. He was working at a hospital in East Tennessee. He was a ER doctor. Then he had his first round of discipline. And the first thing that'll happen to you when you have some public discipline, but you haven't lost your license, is you might get dropped by private health insurance. You might get dropped by your hospital, which is what happened to him. He was fired. Well, now what are your prospects? Now your prospects are going to be cash clinics selling prescriptions for cash, serving the uninsured. Cosmetic surgery actually is a big one. Things that are not covered by insurance. And so as you go down this, I call it sort of a slippery slope or the invisible hand of the market, right? They're pushing you towards the people who are least able to protect themselves. Also, addiction treatment. There's a reason why he was selling Suboxone scripts on the streets. Is we don't adequately fund and provide addiction treatment in this country. Lawyers do the same thing. So if you get disciplined as a lawyer, you're probably going to be fired from your firm. Now what can you do? Well, you can hang a shingle. You can do solo practice. You might be being an appointed lawyer in a criminal case for an indigent defendant. You might work in immigration. You might work in slip and fall injury. Again, it's going to be the people who are least able to protect themselves who are going to get those bad apples that have fallen down through the disciplinary system without actually getting their license removed. In the end, LaPaglia at his sentencing hearing for the federal case testified that he was serving as a kind of primary care doctor to a halfway house where people were with drug addiction problems were living by court order. And the person who ran this halfway house said, they don't have insurance. They don't have the ability to pay for medical care. It used to be that whenever they were sick, I would drive them to the ER. And instead, now we have Dr. LaPaglia. He's such a blessing because they can get medical care without, having to go to the ER. And I'm thinking, that's really coercive. Like they're in this halfway house by court order, and here comes your doctor. It's Dr. LaPaglia. So I think we need more research. We need to learn more about how the disciplinary licensing system interacts with these lower kind of prestige professional opportunities.
So I want to shift for a minute from doctors to lawyers then, because lawyers are another profession where I see the need for there being more than mere certification. I think you could maybe talk me into just having certification, but I get it. Like there's that asymmetric problem, right? Do you think it would be better to have no access to an attorney or a crummy attorney? If you're low income and you need a defense attorney, you're getting prosecuted for something, is it better to have somebody of middling competency or to not have anybody at all?
Well, so they actually have done some research on this. And I think that there are some areas where it's better actually just to have any kind of attorney, right? Now, obviously, what we want is an attorney of appropriate competency. That's going to be
doesn't have sex with his clients or sell Oxycontin to his clients.
Yeah, but this argument, it's better to have an attorney than have no attorney. It's better to have a doctor than have no doctor, is what people say when they're sort of rehabilitating doctors and lawyers that I think are totally inappropriate. What I want to say is this 1%, let's take attorneys, this 1% of attorneys, it's really the bad apples. Okay, you take them out. They're not actually meaningfully, expanding the output of legal services in this country. They're a very small number. What would really meaningfully expand the provision of legal services is to have more reasonable licensing in the front end. So I don't think you have to choose. This is what boards will tell you, is you have to choose no lawyer or a crummy lawyer. I don't think you have to choose. You can make it easier to become a lawyer. You can have different pathways to licensure for, kind of lower, like less skilled, less advanced stuff. There's something called legal technicians that they've been experimenting with. You can relax the definition of unlicensed practice of law, which AI has just forced the boards to do. I don't know if you've tried this, but I've had AI write several contracts for me, and AI does, ChatGPT anyway, does not say, I cannot provide you legal advice anymore. And that is clearly unauthorized practice of law. So anyway, that's a whole other story. But yeah, so you can loosen up the reins and the red tape at the front end, expand the provision of legal services in the country, and then take away this tiny 1%. And I just think you would end up with a better system and more public protection.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that a lot of the professions end up getting bundled together in a way they don't need to be bundled.
Absolutely.
So I did, when I lived in New York years ago, I was going to become, I was going to get involved in real estate. It didn't end up happening. But it was going to be this very specific company where I was going to be like selling dorm rooms or something to college. It was this very specific thing. Like that's it. It was just this one thing. And insofar as there needed to be any regulation at all, I would argue in that case, really, there didn't need to be any regulation at all. But insofar as there needed to be any regulation using just like rational basis, it would be things related to the specific vertical that is comprising maybe 2% of the overall real estate market. But I had to go through classes for everything necessary to become a licensed real estate broker that I had zero ambition or desire to do. And with law, I could see that as well. So like, I really like constitutional law. I'm not an attorney. I've never gone to law school. I think for a comedian who's never gone to law school, I'm really good at constitutional law, but I have no idea how criminal law works. And I'm aware of that. Like I'll have friends on to talk about it. I don't know how criminal law works. I've got nothing going on there. I could see there being situations where if you break the license down into aggregate parts and you go, yes, this person's licensed to handle the regulatory hurdles involved in the state's regime for education. I don't know, whatever the thing is, this specific thing. This over here is constitutional law. This over here is contract law. This over here is just estate planning. Like I could see people where, like one of my friends is an immigration attorney. I don't know how that works, but I could see somebody just becoming authorized to do immigration and specializing in that, as opposed to you got to go to 3 years of law school. You have to learn all of this. You have to pass the bar. And even then, it doesn't seem to necessarily affect that 1% that you're describing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Medicine kind of fractured like this. They kind of you've got nurses and you've got all kinds of healthcare providers, medical providers having different licenses. And that kind of introduces its own problems with turf wars and stuff. But it does also like allow for an expansion of the provision of services because you have lower level licenses that are easier to get than the physician license. And so you're able to, just like you said, like increase the supply of legal help if you were able to have easier pathways for some kinds of tasks. I also think, though, that this idea of like redefining the unlicensed practice of law is going to be important too. Like too many tasks are seen as being, specifically things that only a lawyer can do. And I do think that that's changing.
Well, I like the expanding into the medical field. Like a lot, I think the U.S. healthcare system is 101% differences we need to do. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think it's lots of little things. But one of the big little things is constricting supply. If we're constricting the supply of healthcare providers, shout out to the American Medical Association. You've been doing a bang-up job for the last 100 years and really restricting the supply of doctors available to us. Thanks, guys. Thanks, AMA. If we're going to do that, we're going to raise costs. So that's something that has happened in the medical field where we'll go, look, you have to have a lot of medical training before we let you do surgery, which I'm fine with, by the way. But we're going to authorize in certain states nurse practitioners. We think you are capable of figuring out when somebody has a bacterial infection and giving antibiotics. Like there are certain things that are going to be somewhat run of the mill that do not require 8 years of dedicated medical attention. It's just you need to know the basics of this, and we don't have to have the doctor prescribe birth control. We can just have a pharmacist do that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's something you could do for law. People are talking about that.
Okay. Well, before we get into other solutions, I will circle back to costs now. You mentioned in the book, economists have found that licensing reduces innovation and welfare broadly construed. Can you elaborate on that? What are some of the unseen costs of all this?
Yeah, so innovation, everything from like innovations in the more prestigious professions like medicine, but also like littler innovations. So I don't know if this actually made it in the book, but I saw some vet techs. So if you want to be a veterinary technician, which actually I was a veterinary technician when I was in high school, unlicensed, was not licensed in California. but it's essentially like a nurse kind of for a veterinarian. If you want to be a vet tech, you have to have a license in Tennessee. And you have to have an on-premises veterinary doctor supervising you at the place. And these vet techs came up with a business idea. They had this innovative business idea. And this also hit home because I had a very old dog. If you want to go on vacation and your dog's like kind of a high maintenance dog with like really intense medicine needed, that you give at home as the owner, but it's kind of a big deal. It's like hard to ask your neighbor. We will come. We're vet techs. We can, we give this medicine all day long. It could be intravenous or not, probably not intravenous, but, subcutaneous or something. So they had this great idea for a business and it was totally killed by the board. It was, you are a vet tech. You can only do this stuff if you are on the same premises as a veterinarian. Never mind that the owner can do it, right? Like this is exactly something an owner is doing on their own dog. So it was all these little things, these little innovations. Another one was somebody coming and doing your hair at your house. The hair board really fought that. Another one was an AI.
They fought it because presently I'm the hair board. You have to get a license from us to do hair braiding or barbering or styling. And we're able to make a decent amount of money by people coming into our salon. If people just went to other people's houses, that would really cut down on our model. And I, the guy that owns the salon, may not be able to pay for the salon anymore. Like it would really force me to alter my business practice if my competition could cut that much overhead out.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. So the people who are on the board tend to be the salon owners. And so that cuts a lot of overhead out and you can really compete on price. So probably at bottom, there was this price competition problem. I also tend to think that they worry about their lifestyle. It's like, I don't want to go to other people's houses, This is true, I think, for telemedicine for doctors, too. Doctors hate telemedicine for obvious reasons. It's just miserable to sit there staring at a computer all day. You want people to have that, you didn't go to medical school to be just on your computer all day. And so, a lot of people don't want to go into people's houses. They don't want to have to turn into that kind of hairstylist. And so they don't want that kind of competition. So it's price competition. And I also think it's just kind of lifestyle competition that the boards don't like. There was one about another business that was killed. This was like a multi-million-dollar business about using AI to facially recognize people coming into schools and hospitals that maybe shouldn't have been there. That was killed by the alarm system installers. So yeah, if you have a new business idea and it touches on a profession, if it is arguably in the realm of a profession, you're going to be working in what we call an innovation, like a kill zone. You're going to be working in an area that could potentially get killed by regulation. And I think that the cost of that is impossible to measure, but I think it's really tremendous. And in the law profession, this is a big problem too, with the rise of automated legal help and how much they have struggled to get, the legal kind of blessing of the boards.
This is a broad question, but I'm curious to your answer on it. If you were making a pie chart of the percent of licensing that is genuinely there in a beneficial way for the public versus protectionist nonsense, how would you allocate those numbers?
Well, if you mean number of professions, I would say about half. I could probably go down the list of professions and say half of these can either be deregulated or regulated through a more straightforward code-based system, like do these things, do the following things. And if you're not doing them, maybe we'll inspect. Then you're going to have a problem with your license. The one I would put in that category is hair. If we want to worry about the use of chemicals, we want to worry about infection, then you can have a straightforward set of protocols, which we have, by the way, for tattoos. And that would seem like a pretty, at least equally dangerous, if not more dangerous type situation. Here's what you have to do. And if you're not doing it, then you've got a problem. That to me is not a professional license like we talked about before. So about half. If you're talking about numbers of practitioners, it's going to be actually a lot less than that. And this is part of one of the motivations of the book was to say, let's stop talking about hair, even though I do talk a lot about hair. Let's stop talking about alarm systems and auctioneers because these are actually a very small, or let's not stop talking about them, but let's move the conversation beyond them because these ridiculous professions, hair is not a ridiculous profession, okay? But these professions that we really ridiculously should not.
The prospect of danger is ridiculous.
The prospect of danger is ridiculous, exactly.
Like
And so
I've got a bit in my stand-up, Rebecca, where like Florida, you have to get a license to be a psychic. God, God forbid, God forbid, Rebecca, that you have a bunch of incompetent psychics running around depriving people of good psychic imagery. I
of
mean, can you
knowing
imagine if there were a bunch of charlatans on the streets of Miami? Thank God we have a licensing regime for that.
I want to know how you get in trouble. Like your predictions don't come true? Like is
I
that
think
your
you get in
disciplinary
trouble by
hearing?
practicing psychic without a license. I think that's
Yeah,
pretty much all that board probably does.
exactly. Well, um the problem with dealing with only the most ridiculous examples is that we're not actually going to cover that much ground in
Mm.
terms of the cost to the consumer and the effect on workers. We need to take on the medical professions and the law profession too for reform, not for delicensure, but for reform. So nurses are the biggest profession, like by far bigger than doctors. Teachers are about as big as nurses. Teachers are kind of licensed through a little bit of a different system than what the book is about. But no matter how you slice it, if you only go for the low-hanging fruit, if you only go for delicensure, you're just going to be hitting the very margin of this problem. So I have two answers for you, basically. Either half, or all of it. All of it has problems that need to be addressed that are ridiculous. What happens to nurses and doctors in their discipline and how harsh their rules are at the entry and kind of red tape stage. They're all ridiculous. It's just not. We're not going to delicense them.
Do you need a license to be a teacher? Like, if theoretically, let's say I decide I want to go become a history teacher at a charter school or something like that. Like, I don't know pedagogy. There are things that I should learn, but I really like history. I'm fun. I'm engaging. I could see a career track there. Would I need to be licensed in most states, or is it just when you're in a public school?
Just when you're in a public school. I imagine charters actually. It depends. I don't really know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if some states say charter teachers have to be licensed through the public school system, or if they say, you can draw teachers from another pool. But I actually don't put teachers in this book because you can be a teacher at a private school without a license. And that was the
Okay.
definition that I used.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, some
Okay.
people have said that's not really fair because public school teacher is its own profession, and that's a really important profession, and it's also regulated by a board. But I just had to draw the line somewhere. But
Sure.
yeah.
Well, on that, before we get to solutions, then, you have interesting stuff in the book about unions. We kind of talked about this at the beginning of the interview. I had never thought about the potentiality that these guilds or licensing boards had eaten away at unions. I had just kind of always assumed, oh, it's we removed certain legal obligations to join a union, and then that combined with the way American manufacturing's declined, we moved to a service economy. Like, I just kind of assumed it was all economic, explaining away why unions declined. I get the impression from your book that unions declined in large part because the activity's been gobbled up by the guilds. And so if you like unions, guilds or these licensing boards are kind of the thing keeping your unions from growing. Am I in the ballpark?
So I think this is a tempting way of reading the data, and I think it's wrong. So there's this graph where you can see from 1950 to the present, unions are going down from 30% of the workforce down to like 10, and then licensing is going from 10 up to 30. And remember, that's because we're talking about occupational licensing in this particular context. So this has caused people to make the argument that you're making, which is one is replacing the other. And I actually think you were right the first time when you said it's just economic, offshoring. It's a lot, all the reasons why unions are on the decline have actually, I think, sort of nothing to do with why licensing is on the rise. It is true that both provide some protection to workers. I would argue that as a way of protecting workers, licensing is just much inferior to
Yeah.
unionization. And I'm not a union expert, so I don't want to say a lot about unionization and like all its pros and cons. But what you will notice is that at least unionization says that the goal is to protect the worker, and it
Yeah.
designs its rules and its systems around that idea. It's based on the idea of bargaining power asymmetry, which you're not going to have most of the time in the context of professional licenses. And it's just empirically uh, has a different effect. So the
Yeah.
effect in unionization, the effect on the consumer of, having to pay more for unionization is more ambiguous. In the case of licensing, it's a lot more straightforward that like we're just paying a lot more for licensing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, like, for being a dude in a waistcoat, I'm surprisingly pro-union, at least in the abstract. Like, I makes total sense to me that you would want to leverage your bargaining power by collectivizing with your fellow workers in order to get the best negotiating with the business that you're employed by. I like that. That seems like a good system. That's different than licensing. Most of the time, a significant amount of the time, licensing is not collective bargaining with an employer. It's I am self-employed and I am not allowed to enter the profession unless I get permission from all of the already self-employed people. And they want me to do a bunch of bullshit in order to join their club to keep me out. Like it's a bunch of speed bumps to stop me from competing with them. It's not that we're all advocating against the CEO of the company. A bunch of us are running our own companies.
That's right. And, people will push back against that and say that's not true for a lot of the healthcare professionals. And, they are kind of, bargaining with a big corporate type person at the other side of the bargaining table. But you have associations for that. You have you already have a nurses union, for example, like literally a union. So it just doesn't, I don't think it makes sense to view one as a replacement for the other. By the way, can I just say that I now know what a waistcoat is? I have wondered this my whole life.
Uh-huh.
I was like, what is a waistcoat? But it's a vest? See, I would have called that a vest.
So keep in mind that despite what you're looking at, I'm just a dude from Oklahoma that's cosplaying as a British lord on my day-to-day life. Like deep down, I'm from Oklahoma County.
Okay.
But I believe, or at least I linguistically make the relevant distinction of a vest is when it's straight down the middle. A waistcoat is double-breasted where it wraps around. So when you see a guy dressed like Bob Cratchit, as I tend to do, that's a waistcoat. Whereas when it's a more simple, just ... that's going to be a vest.
Okay.
And if anybody calls me out on it, I'm just going to say this is how it works in Oklahoma, and no one will know. This is my
I've learned
fallback.
so much. I've learned so much.
Thank you. We'll wrap up in a minute, but do you have maybe 5-10 minutes more to go over solutions that would make the system better?
Yeah, of course.
Great. Okay, one thing, it seems to me that if we kept everything in place, which I want to change a lot, but if we kept everything in place, a very basic failsafe that I would put in for any of the big prestigious boards like medical boards and the Bar Association is if you are convicted of a crime in the course of doing your job, your license is automatically suspended until you get the board to appeal the decision. Like the default should be if you are convicted of a felony in our field, you don't get to practice it till you convince us otherwise. Because I get the impression it's the exact opposite, where we'll convict you and then like 4 years later, the board will get around to going, yeah, he probably shouldn't be selling medicine.
Yeah, although usually by that time, he's done his time. It's usually a he, not always. He's done his time, so we're not going to pile on. He already has lots of consequences, so maybe we'll actually let this one slide. Yeah, okay, so this is problematic for a couple of reasons. I want to endorse it, but part of the problem is if you do it to tie it to the conviction, convictions take a year or more, so, that's like a huge delay. If you tie it to the indictment, now you're just going to pull somebody's license for merely an accusation. I actually think most of the time that's probably the right thing to do, but I'm not sure you'd want to make it so automatic. One thing I want people to understand when they read my book is that there's just going to have to be some judgment calls, right? Like this is not going to be solved by like bright line, like this is the rule. And that's what the professions have been saying forever. What I want is somebody else making those judgment calls. I want somebody else reading the file. What does it mean to be at work? I agree, at work, like fine. But what is it? Is it, you're DUI driving to work? You get a DUI driving home from work? Maybe both of them actually would sound like things that we don't want to let.
Which I would be opposed to you getting a DUI, but I don't know that I would suspend your license because it's not really directly related to your job. And like that might be a situation where I'm like, you know what? He's a really good doctor. He's struggling. It's not affecting his job. Like I could see myself under that situation being in favor of the doctor AA meeting thing.
Yeah. And I think that like these calls need to be made in a somewhat of a case-by-case basis. So we do need more guidance. I think that we could do with a lot more guidance about how disciplinary cases work, and this is something they have in the UK. Speaking of waistcoats. They do a very good job of spelling out what is the purpose of discipline, what are the default results, consequences for certain kinds of conduct, and you can deviate from them, but it's all very out in the open. It's very specific, and you have to follow it. I think we should have that. But even within that framework, it's guidance, right? Like, you're going to have some judgment calls. The judgment needs to be made by somebody other than the profession itself. Specifically like the organized association making these judgments, which is functionally what we have now.
Right. And I think this is the big distinction between you and the libertarians, because there is some overlap there. You're very sympathetic to the look, guys, look, this is ridiculous protectionism. Like, you're on board with that. And like, guys, this is overregulated and it's crony capitalist regulatory capture. But where you depart is the libertarians will generally come up with any method possible to remove the government from the equation. Whereas if I'm understanding you correctly, what you want to do is, for the minority of professions that we agree should have some kind of licensing system to them, you want to swap the self-governance of the profession with bureaucrats. Have an actual state apparatus where there's, if I'm reading you right, look, we have people that are appointed by the state who are experts in medicine and experts in law, and it's their job to review these cases rather than all of our buddies that work in the same field as us, which would present a conflict of interest anywhere else.
That's right. And part of my inspiration for this idea was when I was sitting in these board meetings and slapping my forehead, the people slapping their forehead too were the state employees. So the lawyer for the board, or the administrators who run the whole licensing system, they see the big picture of the profession and its bad apples. They see the ways in which these onerous entry rules affect people who want to be in the profession. They get the calls from the people saying, what do you mean I have to have majored in this specific thing? I went to college 20 years ago. Why did you change this? It's those people that were, I think, the most reasonable, and they didn't have any power. They didn't have a vote. At the end of the day, this is another example. So the auctioneer board that went after the
dude who was stealing money from the people he was auctioneering for.
No. This was a guy who was an unlicensed auctioneer.
Oh, okay.
And he was a fireman doing a charity auction for the local fire department.
What a criminal. Yeah.
And the staff said, look, we gave him a warning, like blah, blah, blah. And they were like, oh, no warning. We're giving him the maximum fine. Like, this is the kind of reasonable perspective that I wanted to see win the day. And so I think that, yes, bureaucratic governance gets a bad rap, maybe. And we should only use it where we have to, but I think it is much better. You need the input of the professionals, maybe, for specific information about how this would cash out in terms of practice, and also, really technical diagnostic or legal strategy. But really, most of the stuff was pretty straightforward and better understood by the staff, who, by the way, actually knew the statutes, knew the rules, because these boards are made up of volunteers. They're super busy. They don't know the rules and statutes that they're interpreting.
Yeah. I think I've got a decent dollop of libertarian in me. That being said, though, I mean, my first question would just be, does this need to be licensed at all? And I would say most of the time you can probably handle things with certifications. I think certifications being a premature of quality control that is not legally binding. It's not a gatekeeper. I think most of the time could do that. When we move past that to stuff where we're like, no, there needs to be some kind of actual governmental quality control. If I'm having to pick with my libertarian bona fides between bureaucrats or crony capitalists, I'd rather go with the bureaucrats. I don't love this situation, but of those options, I think you've talked me into, I would rather have the professional expert than self-governing guild. I think the guild just has a lot more inefficiency, unseen costs, and anti-competitive behavior to it. Whereas the bureaucrat is just going to be kind of irritating and, of middling competency. But still, I think you've talked me into it, is what I'm saying. I think you've got me.
Well, I'm glad I convinced you. That's definitely my perspective.
Okay. Can I lob out a couple of other proposals that I've heard from people? I was talking to somebody, I don't think it was IJ, but it was a similar group. It might have been like PLF or something like that, where, or maybe the Goldwater Institute. where they had sort of floated the idea that you should be able to sue a licensing board in court. And at that point, they should have to defend themselves in a jury situation as to whether they really have a rational basis for governing a profession. And so if in California, I take the barbering board to court and they make their impassioned speech about how, if barbers screw up, they cut people's heads off, and then the jury goes, this is nonsense. If the jury goes, this is ridiculous, you just disband the board. Is that a reasonable approach, or would that just be, a over the top way?
I don't think litigation is a good strategy. So there's also antitrust litigation, which is actually what got me into this in the first place. I'm moonlighting as this. I'm really an antitrust professor. Antitrust isn't great because so much of what's bad about licensing board regulation does not pose competitive problems. What you're describing are constitutional suits, like saying that there's no nexus between what this rule is supposed to do and actually the public protection, or what is actually doing and what it's supposed to be doing. Rational basis. I think that the IJ and the libertarians who are doing this are playing with fire, because if you give real teeth to a rational basis, then it's not just the professional regulations that I don't like that are going to be in trouble. It's really a huge swath of democratically created regulation that is now going to be put in the power of the courts. And this is something that libertarians are fine with, because they don't really believe in state regulation as being a good thing, and so they would like to see less of it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's right, and I think putting the onus on the state to defend in every case a cost-benefit analysis, essentially, which is kind of what IJ wants to do to rational basis or something like that, I think that probably goes too far. I will say that the libertarian lawfare folks have switched tactics from the 14th Amendment rational basis to the First Amendment, because the First Amendment has been a more powerful way to strike down professional licensing and other laws that they don't like. I think this is even worse. Okay, I think the expansion of the First Amendment has been one of the more deleterious legal developments of the last 10 years, to the point where you have this right to say anything, sort of undoes really the whole idea of maybe attorney licensure, right? What do attorneys do but say things? I mean, that's kind of like our whole thing. Too much of what professionals do, and that I think states have very appropriate interests in regulating, is speech. And the First Amendment has become so absolutist, or at least using the First Amendment to get at this, risks turning the First Amendment into something so absolutist that it's just going to create all kinds of problems for other state regulation. So, no, I am not really in favor of that. Now, there are individual suits that they bring. I think there's no rational basis, and I'm sort of fine with that. But the more extreme expansion of First Amendment and rational basis analysis to cover this kind of stuff, I'm not in favor of.
I think I'm with you on the First Amendment. As somebody that's very dedicated to free speech, I worry that we're going to overload that apple cart, because there are lots of cases where I would like I don't remember the court case specifically, but the gay cake maker in Colorado from 10, 15 years ago was done on free speech grounds. And I'm like, well, that seems to me to really comport more with establishment of religion and, coercion of religion. But they went with free speech because the Supreme Court's so pro free speech, they thought it would be a better way of doing it. I'm worried if we just keep hanging stuff on free speech all the time, eventually somebody's going to go no, and we're going to lose a lot of the free speech protections we have. But I will say I'm very sympathetic to the rational basis thing, and I'm out of my element here. But as I understand it, when we're looking at constitutional rights, there's rational basis and I guess intermediate scrutiny and strict scrutiny. So when we're talking about an important constitutional right like freedom of speech or the Second Amendment, and you want to abrogate those rights, the state can't just say, well, this is the kind of thing a state does. It has to have a really, really, really good reason, and that's strict scrutiny. It makes sense to me to do that with economics, with doing your profession. You have a right to work. You have a right to a living, and saying you don't just have rational basis of a state could theoretically want to regulate barbers. There has to be a really, really good public safety hurdle to get over before you can do that.
Yeah. So, but rational basis kicks in not when you have like a core constitutional right. The constitutional right is the right to rational regulation. So, so we're talking about all state regulation, all state laws. If, the libertarians want to call it the right to earn a living or economic rights or whatever, but those aren't really like in the Constitution in the way the First Amendment is, or even equal protection. So what it means, because all regulation affects people's pocketbooks, is sort of economic in most cases, is that every single state law would have to be defended in a court according to this sort of kind of cost benefit analysis. And even as I say that, it kind of sounds good. The problem is the power that it deals to the judges, right? It's like keep in mind, this is a regulation that has been created through the democratic process, and now a judge can just step in and say, I mean, the problem is Lochner. I'm sure you know this case if you're a student of the Constitution. And, Lochner was an economic regulation that was for the benefit of bakers, and the legislature liked it. And then the court said, no, we don't like this regulation. Essentially, we don't believe in this kind of economic regulation. We feel like we've moved on. And I think that worry that you're going to end up with judges doing legislating, I think, is pretty real.
Okay.
So I think it could have more bite than it has now. Look, I don't think there's no room for correction. I think it's pretty toothless right now, but I worry more about its expansion than the libertarians do.
Okay. Well, then let's flip it and look at it legislatively. Let's say I'm a member of Congress, and somehow I'm a powerful member of Congress. What if we said, hey, if you want matching Medicare or highway funds or something, you want a bunch of federal money coming in from the federal government, that's fine. Any state that has a licensing regime, you have to acknowledge their licensees. So if you're in Tennessee and you want federal funding, doctors that are allowed to practice medicine in Texas are now allowed to practice medicine in Tennessee. You don't want to have them in, that's fine. You don't get the Medicare, you don't get the highway funding. Good luck to you. What would happen if the federal government tried to strong-arm states just into interoperability?
So it's funny. I was approached by somebody who was advising the Council on Economic Advisors for Trump about this very question. What can the federal government do? And I thought about this, threaten to withhold highway funding, threaten to withhold Medicare, Medicaid funding. To me, I just think that, like, I believe in institutions. I believe in norms. I believe in being as the least terrorism that we can do to each other right now is good.
Uh-huh.
And to me, that just felt like putting a gun to the head of the states. Yes, that is what I want them to do. I want them to do those things. I think the federal government putting the gun to the head of the states, which is exactly what it would be to say, to defund the highways and defund Medicare, Medicaid, it's not really like a federalism problem.
You can't be in favor of local control and in favor of the solution that I just brought up. Like they're mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think you need to do more carrots than sticks, I guess is what I'll say. I think we need to get the states to do that, but I think it kind of violates the principles of federalism to step in and say, you have to do this or we're going to defund you. I just think that that's bully politics, and I think that that's how this part of the mess that we're in right now. So I actually suggested they not do that, and then they didn't take my advice.
Well, I agree with you. I'm a big fan of federalism, but I'm also becoming more jaded towards the actual functionality of it as time goes on, like with zoning and stuff like that. I'll put a pin in that, but your point is well taken. So then would the preferred thing just be citizens get more involved at the state level, talk to your state legislature and say, hey, swap the licensing board with bureaucrats or whatever what would be the best way to effect the changes you would like to see?
So I think that state legislatures have to take this on. I think they have to realize how pressing these issues are. On the same day, practically, they'll pass a bill for $3 billion of opioid relief, and then another, licensing bill that's working at cross purposes with that. I think that bad licensing policy is very expensive for the states. And I haven't made this clear in the interview, but I think that state licensing boards have a lot of the share to blame of the blame for the opioid crisis. So this is very expensive for states, and they're not addressing it. So we need to get the attention of the legislatures. The citizens need to get attention of the legislators. I think we just could have a couple of states, maybe big states, do this well and serve as an example. And then maybe we'll learn that, like, not everybody is going to die if we don't, body fluids are not going to come flying out of our heads if we don't have the same licensing regime for hair that we've had for 100 years. And then, like, I think that if we can show that it's not the end of the world, and by the way, some states are doing this. Arizona has universal licensure, universal recognition, where if you're licensed anywhere, you can practice in Arizona. People have not been dropping dead for a bad professional service in Arizona, from what I can tell. So yeah, I think the answer lies with the legislators in the states, and we need to get their attention and show them how costly the current system actually is, and that reasonable professional regulation is a much better solution for everybody, including the states.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think if in any state you care to listen or you care to mention that raising the minimum wage came to the floor of the House of Representatives, you would find the legislators would be very galvanized in action on that particular point, whether they thought minimum wage is price control, it's going to cause unemployment, or alternately, minimum wage is essential to a minimum standard of living. Regardless of where you fall on that, I think you would find that the average state legislator would have very, very intense feelings about that and would give speeches about it and would want to vote on it. And that as big of an issue as minimum wages is dwarfed by everything we've talked about today. As you brought up, the amount of people that are covered by licensing is dramatically higher than the amount of people that are covered by minimum wage. The economic toll of unnecessary licensing is greater than sales taxes in most states. So for legislators that are opposed to sales taxes, that want to prune back taxes, this is a way that you can prune back taxes. So there are really, really good reasons that legislators should be focusing on this. So folks at home, if you know a legislator, like make them read Rebecca's book.
Please.
And Rebecca, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I really did enjoy your book. That book, again, is The Licensing Racket, How We Decide Who's Allowed to Work and Why It Goes Wrong. There's more of the book that we did not discuss. It is well written. It will make your blood pressure go up. So if you've got high blood pressure already, make sure you get in some statins before you read it. You will be as irked and irritated as I was. That being said, though, for the policy wonks listening to the show, particularly if you're the sort of person like me who just will be eating hot dogs with friends and be like, we need to talk about licensing for a minute. If you are one of these irritating policy wonks of my ilk, this will be a great book for you. I highlighted the hell out of this book so that I have all these stats on command if I need them, if I go talk to people. And Rebecca Allensworth, I'm so glad that you did the yeoman's work putting all of this together on behalf of a grateful nation. Thank you for sitting in all these board meetings for 7 years writing this book.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I was appreciated.
And final note, if you want to get the book, you can get that, I think, anywhere books are sold, but I list all of the books that are discussed in this program at mightyheaton.com/featured. Okay, Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Rebecca Allensworth, for coming on to discuss licensing. Thank you, patron Sean Finnerty, who recommended today's guest. And thank you, all patrons, for making this show possible. You have a license to be awesome. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.